Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity Project, a project based on the assertion that crime and law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. Now, for this video, I'm just doing a review of my recent debate with Michael Liebowitz on the topic of self-ownership as a foundation for rights. Now, I think I'll put a link in the description for the debate so people can check it out. And I'll also put a link in the description for Michael's channel, which is the Rational Egoist, which is a channel worth checking out. There's lots of interesting conversations on there. Now, this debate that we had, I think it was a bit frustrating for both of us. I think from Michael's point of view, I wasn't addressing the argument in the way that he had prepared for and anticipated. And from my point of view, it was frustrating because Michael wasn't really taking on my arguments, possibly because he didn't really feel prepared to do so. So what I want to do is I want to just lay out what my argument was, what I want to steelman Michael's argument as best I can and lay out what his objections were to my arguments, and then why I think those objections don't hold water. So basically, the topic of the debate was self-ownership as a foundation for rights. Michael disagrees with self-ownership as a foundation of rights, and I obviously assert that self-ownership is the foundation for rights and the only foundation for rights, and that's obviously what my Nations of Sanity project is based on. So my justification for self-ownership as the foundation for rights is quite simple. It is self-ownership, the concept of individual self-ownership is the only conceptualization of rights. It's the only foundational right that gives us a coherent conceptualization, a coherent framework for rights. In other words, without self-ownership, rights doesn't make sense. And with self-ownership, rights do make sense. And every right that we would claim, whether it's the right of free speech, the right to own property, the right to not be aggressed against, all of these things depend on individual self-ownership. Without the right over ourselves, our claim of right over anything else just becomes incoherent nonsense. So this kind of undeniable logic that follows on from individual self-ownership, where with self-ownership, rights works, it's internally consistent, logically, objectively identifiable, universalizable, that way in which it works, that reveals the moral truth of individual self-ownership and reveals it as the only possible foundation for rights. Now, Michael had two main objections to this. The first objection was that he claimed that I was using circular reasoning because I'm giving self-ownership, which is itself a rights claim, as a foundation for other rights claims. So he says I'm using a right as a foundation for rights. And that's, he's saying that's circular. And then the other objection that he had was that I wasn't justifying rights itself. Like I'm presupposing rights and then using self-ownership as my foundation and going on from there. But I'm not doing any work to actually prove rights itself. Now, for that particular criticism, I actually agree that I'm not doing that. I'm not just, Michael is right to point that out. I am not justifying rights itself, but I'm not claiming to do that either. My contention is that self-ownership is the only coherent foundation for rights, but that presupposes rights. I'm saying if rights is a thing, then self-ownership is an undeniable, objective, moral truth. But I'm not saying that rights is definitely a thing. And I don't think this kind of defeats my argument because the fact of the matter is nobody, it's not just me that can't prove that rights is a thing, nobody can. And this goes back to the is-ought problem that is famous by a philosopher called Hume, who said you can't get an ought from an is. And what he means by that is you can't get the morality, which is the ought, from facts, which is the is. Just because you can point to a set of facts, but that doesn't tell you what should be, that just tells you what is. And there's nothing about what is that objectively identifies even the existence of a morality, let alone telling you what that morality should be. So I fully accept that I am not saying that rights itself is definitely a thing. I can't objectively prove rights or morality. But what I can do is objectively prove self-ownership if we presuppose moral rights. So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying if there's such a thing as rights, then self-ownership is logically, undeniably, the only foundation that can give us a coherent framework for rights. And if we reject self-ownership, we're essentially rejecting rights altogether. But somebody could do that. Someone could reject rights altogether. And I can't tell them that they're objectively wrong. I can only tell them they're objectively wrong if they reject self-ownership but invoke rights. If they try to make some kind of rights claim whilst rejecting self-ownership, then they're just going to walk into contradictions and their claim's going to be incoherent, because how can anyone have rights claim over anything if they don't first have right over ourselves? As I say, every right we have has that foundation of individual self-ownership. You have a right of free speech because you own yourself. You have a right to property because you own yourself, and the first use principles apply from your individual self-ownership. If we both have a right to pick an apple from a wild tree, then whoever picks that apple first is the person who has the right to it, because the person who picks it first doesn't have to aggress to anybody against anybody to pick that apple, whereas the next person who comes along who wants to take that apple away from me would obviously have to aggress against me to do so. So I think that's pretty kind of undeniable. And the frustrating thing for me in this debate was that Michael didn't even really address that argument, because he was stuck on the fact that my argument falls down for two reasons. One, that I'm not justifying rights in the first place, but I'm giving an objective moral framework for rights that presupposes rights. And then the other thing is that I'm using a right as a foundation for rights. And he says that's circular. Now, again, I disagree with him, because the fact that you have to presuppose rights to even begin the conversation about rights is an undeniable fact. Like the fact that I cannot bridge the is-ought problem without a hypothetical imperative or a presupposition. In other words, I can't say there is an ought without a foundational ought that underpins all the other oughts. So it's unavoidable. You have to have rights can only have a foundation of rights. Like morality can only have moral foundations. Like I say, you can't get morality from facts. You can only get morality from morality, or from a hypothetical imperative. Like and when I say hypothetical imperative, I mean like you add a condition. Like for example, I can't say that you should live healthy, or for example, just because a food is objectively unhealthy, I can't say that you shouldn't eat that. But I could say that if you don't want to eat unhealthy foods, then you shouldn't eat that because it is an unhealthy food. So like the facts only give us an ought if we add the hypothetical imperative, or if we add a presupposed ought that underpins all the other oughts. And the only ought or moral claim that we need to underpin self-ownership is simply that there is even such a thing as moral rights. And once we accept there even is such a thing as moral rights, then self-ownership is logically undeniable. And if Michael or anybody else disputes that claim, then I want to hear those arguments. So Michael, if you're listening, I very much would like to perhaps rearrange a discussion or debate where we deal with that claim, because we didn't really deal with that claim because we were obviously stuck on your objections over the fact that I'm using rights as a foundation for rights, and the fact that I'm not justifying rights, both of which I'm fully prepared to admit that, you know, you are correct that I'm doing that, but I think that you're incorrect in claiming that this is in some way defeating my argument, because rights can only have a foundation of rights, like just like mathematics has a mathematical foundation. 1 + 1 = 2, and that mathematical truth gives us the foundation for all the more complicated sums that we would do from there. And if we tried to say that 1 + 1 = 3, then maths wouldn't make sense if we presuppose that. So that's how we know that 1 + 1 = 2, apart from the fact that it's obviously demonstratable, but it's also logically deducible. It's also something that we can identify through basic logic and abstract thinking by the fact that 1 + 1 = 2, not just because we can demonstrate that that is true in of itself, but the fact that it fits with mathematics going forward. It doesn't contradict any mathematical calculations going forward. all of those things depend on that basic moral truth that 1 + 1 = 2. And likewise, all of our moral claims regarding rights, whether we're talking about free speech or property ownership or the right to not be enslaved, whatever, or the right to life, all of these things, the right over our body, all of these things are just an offshoot of individual self-ownership. And that is what makes self-ownership the foundation for rights, because you cannot have any rights coherently without that foundation of individual self-ownership sitting under it. And the fact that I cannot prove to you that rights itself exists doesn't change the fact that I can prove to you that if rights exists, then self-ownership is undeniably the only coherent foundation for rights. And the fact that I cannot prove to you that rights do exist doesn't tell anyone anything other than the fact that Hume's is-ought problem is an unsolvable problem. It's a simple, undeniable fact that nobody, and this includes Michael, and if you think you've solved the is-ought problem, then please walk me through that. But every explanation I've heard from yourself or other objectivists who claim they have solved the is-ought problem just reveals that they haven't, because they always presuppose an ought. They always presuppose a right. They say, oh, well, it comes from the right to life, but that's still presupposing a right. Or they say, we ought to preserve right, and that's presupposing that hypothetical imperative of we ought to preserve life. Why should we ought to preserve life? If that poison is going to kill me, why can't I drink it? You know what I mean? Like the fact that that's poison and it will kill me doesn't tell me the ought behind why I shouldn't kill myself. And if we actually examine rights in that way and actually look at what fits coherently and what doesn't fit coherently, then we will find out that self-ownership is the only foundation for rights that actually works coherently. With self-ownership, rights work. Without self-ownership, rights don't work. They just become incoherent nonsense. And that simple fact is what reveals self-ownership as the undeniable truth, the undeniable foundation for rights. So I hope I've made that point clear. I obviously did try to make this case in my debate with Michael. And Michael, if you're listening to this, I hope I've made it clearer in this video than I did in our debate. If you do have arguments against what I am asserting with regards to the undeniable coherence that follows on from individual self-ownership, or the fact that nobody can get an ought from an is without adding a presupposition. In other words, you would have to presuppose rights as well as I am to begin a conversation about rights as rights or a moral framework. But the fact of the matter is if you presuppose rights, then self-ownership becomes logically undeniable. And if you reject self-ownership, then you're essentially rejecting rights as well. But you can do that. You can reject rights altogether. So the person that rejects morality and rejects rights, I have no argument against him. But the person who says there is such a thing as morality and rights, but rejects self-ownership, that's the person I can have the argument with. And Michael, if you want to have that debate, or if anybody else listening to this wants to have that debate and try and dispute my claim that self-ownership is literally the only possible, logically coherent foundation for rights. Self-ownership is the only way, and that's what makes it the foundation for rights. Without self-ownership, rights don't work. With it, they do. Anyway, as I say, there's a link in the description to the debate that I'm referring to for anyone who wants to check that out. There's a link to Michael's channel as well, and there's also a link to the Nations of Sanity Project website and this YouTube channel. Our idea of establishing the NAPA's law as the only way to create a truly free society, and establishing it as the terms of peace as the only way to establish the NAPA's law, are two other objectively undeniable claims that I very much hope people will consider, scrutinize, and when they recognize the truth of it, I hope they will help me spread the word.